Hello, this is Dr. Monique Henderson, English Language Coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Education. And we're here today for Serving Mississippi's English Learners, an introduction, and this is part 3. So if you're just joining us for the first time on part 3, I would encourage you to go back, take a look at part 1 and part 2 of this 3-part webinar series, which will be the first of many from the Mississippi Department of Education. We want to make sure we review our vision, and our vision at the Mississippi Department of Education is to create a world-class educational system that gives students the knowledge and skills to be successful in college and the workforce, and to flourish as parents and citizens. Our mission is to provide leadership through the development of policy and accountability systems, so all of our students are prepared to compete in the global community. And of course, that all students includes our 12,100 or so English learner students located across the state of Mississippi. Looking at our services for EL students, we want to look at those in the larger context of our State Board of Education goals as outlined in our 5-year strategic plan for 2016 through 2020. Goal 1 is that all students be proficient in showing growth in all assessed areas. Our second goal is that every student graduates high school and is ready for college and career. Third, we want to make sure every child has access to a high-quality early childhood program. Next, we want to make sure every school has effective teachers and leaders. Finally, we want every community effectively using a world-class data system to improve student outcomes. So our goals today, what's the purpose of this presentation? We want to discuss academic best practices for English learners. We want to build educator awareness of existing and planned MDE supports. And we want to solicit your input on necessary supports and professional development coming in the future. Let's revisit a scenario that we discussed in prior recordings. Imagine this, close your eyes and picture that you suddenly find yourself transported. You're in a restaurant in a foreign land where you don't speak the language. You're very, very hungry. You need to order a meal. Think about what would help you know how to order in this new language that you don't know at all. How would you like for other people to treat you as you try to communicate your needs? And what would make you more comfortable in your communication? I want you to take just 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Think about and list your ideas. They may have changed from previous webinars. You might have had some new aha moments. So just think about that for a minute and then join me back here. Now that you've made your list, I want you to consider this. Your new EL students, they're probably hoping to see some of the same supports and behaviors that you would find helpful in operating in a new country with a new language. I want you to consider this when you're thinking about best practices for EL students. It can be a really good framework for how you think about English language acquisition. So, what are some research-proven best practices for EL students? I want you to understand, first of all, that in a lot of cases, best practices for EL students are best practices, period. And that's good news because we know that a lot of you are already using best practices for your students. The same activities that build vocabulary for some of your struggling students will also be very effective for your English learner students. So a lot of this you're going to have heard before, but now you're going to be thinking about it and building an understanding in terms of the context of English learner students. So first, one of the things research bears out over and over again is that collaborative learning is an effective strategy in helping ELs to acquire English. Some of the benefits of collaborative learning for our EL population, it gives them opportunities to build social and academic language simultaneously because they're using their social language to make sense of the academic concepts they're learning. At the same time, other students are there to provide them with support They can learn from the English learners, and the English learners can learn from the native English speakers. Collaborative learning also provides ELs with some strong language models. At the same time, ELs see how peers learn and solve problems. They get to be around and have the model of other students who have already functioned in a classroom in these ways, in expected ways. Some collaborative learning tips for ELs. And again, some of these are best practices in general, but thinking now about our EL population, you want to assign different groups and partners regularly. ELs may learn more effectively. They may be more comfortable with some groups and some partners versus others. You might want to consider assigning roles in your collaborative learning to each student in the group and then changing those rules with every activity. So your EL student one time might be the reporter, another time the recorder or the timekeeper, the materials manager. You might want to start with some of the roles that require less English skills, for example, timekeeper, materials manager, and then slowly move them into reporter where they're using verbal language, oral language, and then recorder where they're also using written language. You want to create a safe environment within collaborative learning. You want to set some clear expectations for how other students will treat and interact with ELs as the ELs are making new sense of English. And then you want to nudge the ELs into their new roles. Some other best practices. This can be a challenging one, but you want to alter your speech rate and tone. You want to speak slowly and clearly, almost in a way that feels exaggerated at times. Thinking, though, again, that's probably what you would need if you were trying to make sense yourself of a new language. You want to simplify your vocabulary and sentence structure. An easy-to-understand sentence structure would start with the subject and then move into a simple predicate. You want to repeat keywords and phrases so that they're not probably going to get that vocabulary the first time, but if you're repeating it, that's going to improve the odds of retention. You want to give keywords and phrases in writing with visuals, so that academic vocabulary especially, that you know they're going to be hearing, important vocabulary words, try giving it to them in written form, and then also, when possible, including visual aids. Whenever possible, you want to use models, realia, so that means showing them the real object. So instead of just telling someone about a seashell, you would have a seashell in front of you. If you're talking about a spider, it would be effective to have a model of a spider in front of you. You want to provide graphic organizers when possible so that students can organize their thoughts, organize the information that you have. We know that graphic organizers are also an effective tool with struggling learners across the board. You want to offer your notes to EL students. In some cases, they may decline those notes, but you want to really make them comfortable accepting those notes if they would be helpful. You'll want to consider translating the notes using some of the tools that we outlined in our prior webinar. And then you want to link to background experiences. That's called schematic building. You're taking the student, you're figuring out what their background is, and then you're adding a new layer of knowledge to that. Some other best practices are choral readings. So choral readings where maybe a whole class is reading a portion of a reader's theater or a writing about a topic in science or a topic in social studies. It gives the EL student an opportunity to practice speaking words in a safe way with their English-speaking peers. Again, graphic organizers are best practice for our EL students, also very helpful to struggling students across the board. You want to give your EL students opportunities to sketch, to mold, to act out concepts and ideas. They may not already be ready to demonstrate their knowledge through writing in English or speaking in English, but they might be ready to show what they know through molding and acting out. In my own EL classroom, I found that Play-Doh was a wonderful, wonderful tool in terms of they could take the Play-Doh, sometimes create shapes that would communicate that they understood ideas like love, equity, justice, things like that. Parking lot, you want to have a parking lot so that they can ask questions about language. So an area in your room where if they have a question, maybe they can write it on a note card, write it on a sticky note, and put it in that parking lot. Put it on that poster board, in that box, so that they can ask questions about language, and then you can try to answer those questions. They don't always have time in the course of a classroom discussion, unfortunately, to get to those language questions, especially if the rest of the class doesn't need that instruction. Another best practice that's very popular and that we will be doing some professional development on is something called total physical response. That's where you have students act out, along with you in most cases, meanings of words while they're also saying the words and hearing the words spoken by others. For example, a very simple example would be if you were teaching the word up, you would have students hear the word, say the word as they're moving up or as they're motioning up. So building in that physical response to help really activate and light up the brain so that that word can be remembered because it's been experienced in a physical way. You also want to build on existing background knowledge. We talked about that earlier, the idea of schematic building. You want to provide instructions in writing and explain it verbally, one-on-one or in a small group with other ELs. So it's not enough to just give a quick whole class explanation of what a student is expected to do. You need to provide those steps clearly in the most direct language that you can. You want to consider doing it verbally. You want to consider maybe doing translations. You also can provide models of desired work. You can tell students what to do, but it's a lot easier for them to envision it if they have some models of quality work in front of them. We talked about this earlier, but you might want to use some sentence starters or some stems. So maybe a student isn't ready to write a complete summary of the water cycle, but maybe they can show you that they have knowledge of the different steps and phases in the water cycle by filling in blanks that you've provided for them. So you give them the framework and then they fill in the basics. You want to encourage students to talk and write to you and a partner about what they're learning and questions that they still might have. So anytime that you can have the student take the academic concepts they've been exposed to, give them opportunities to talk about it, give them opportunities to write about it. Because in those cases, you're taking that social language and you're using it to then build academic language, which we know has tremendous, tremendous value for our EL students. You want to provide many opportunities to use the English language. Students we know need to be speaking, they need to be reading, they need to be writing, they need to be listening every day. In some cases, they will tell you they don't have anything to write about, kind of like a traditional English-speaking reluctant writer, right? But you want to keep just gently pushing them and letting them know that the writing is coming and the writing is expected and that you believe that they're able to transition into doing that. Again, you want to use hand and body gestures when possible. Stress high-frequency words in instruction and notes. If you have a key vocabulary word, the student needs to know that that's a key vocabulary word. They need to know that they should prioritize that as they are studying and as they are learning the language, that's an important concept. Everything feels important to a student who doesn't know English, so helping them, guiding them to know what's important and what isn't is very helpful. If possible, you want to have some keywords labeled in the room, kind of like just labels around the room. At the same time, word walls, anchor charts, anything that can visually reinforce vocabulary and concepts is going to give a lot of support and assistance to your EL students. You want to avoid figurative language and idioms. Our EL students, of course, have a difficult enough time understanding the language when it's spoken directly. But when you start including figures of speech, as they're called, it can create a lot of confusion for students. You also probably want to avoid sarcasm with most English learners because it can be very confusing because the words that they're hearing don't match your mood and they don't match your expressions, and so it can create some false understandings about language and about what you're saying. Use academic language that'll help students across the curriculum with more frequency. So if there's a word like compare, contrast, analyze, you want to go ahead and use those words. Make it a priority in your classroom for the student to learn that vocabulary because it'll benefit them not just with you, but throughout the whole day. And remember, we want to take ownership of how the EL student fares, not just in your class, but how can they be successful across the board. One of my favorites is to use wordless books to inspire conversations and eliminate language barriers. There's some really fun new wordless books out there that have some high-level inferencing in them that is required that can really help English learners come alive in terms of their use of language and their understanding. And I will be providing some additional information on that in coming webinars. My hope is that you will be giving students personal dictionaries that they can use to record words and definitions they're learning. So again, a dictionary where they have a word they learned and the meaning, and they can go back, they can take it home with them if possible. They can review it in the evening, bring it back the next day, have it with them to support them when they are taking tests in class, working on different activities, participating in collaborative learning. And I want us to remember the power of cognates. Remember when we talked about if you're in a new country, what is it that you would hope? What is it that might help you to be an effective communicator despite your language challenges? Well, cognates are words from different languages that have a common origin. I'm sure my English majors are aware of this. English shares many commonalities with Latin-based languages, and there are many words that are shared between the languages. So you can look at this and say, cognates, do you know, quotation marks, Spanish? If you're like me, you don't know maybe a lot of Spanish, but you can look at this and you can figure out what words they're talking about. Dinosaurio, for example. You're looking at that, you're thinking, dinosaur has something to do with dinosaurs. Maybe it's not an actual dinosaur, but somehow relating to dinosaurs. You can hear desastre, and you can think, oh, that sounds like disaster. You see what appears to be famoso, favorito, importante. Maybe you're not even sure how to say it, but you can look at it and think, what does that look like in English? And you can figure out basically what they're talking about. Cognates benefit some languages more than others. For our Japanese students, for example, they might not be as helpful, but for French students, Spanish students, Italians, Romanians, it's going to be more helpful. So what's next? Remember that we want to hear from you. We have some available MDE resources that are being rolled out in the next few weeks for English learners. That includes teacher and administrator resource guides. We also want to hear from you and know what professional development do you want to see offered? What resources would be helpful to you? So email me at mohenderson@mdek12.org to share with me your ideas, questions, insights on where you think that we should go next. Some proposed webinar topics that I've heard as I've traveled the state in the last few weeks. People seem to want to know more about best practices for ELs. We hit the very basics of some of that today. Obviously, this was a very superficial view of just these were designed to be quick strategies that you could implement with little to no professional development, little to no training. But more deeper best practices for EL students are needed. I'm hearing that an overview of language acquisition and the stages of language development might be helpful for some of you. I'm hearing an interest in building family and school communication. Again, our second webinar touched on some of that, but digging deeper into that. Since this first webinar really is skimming the surface and giving you the basics. Strengthening academic language of ELs. This is a need that I'm hearing. I'm hearing from teachers that are saying, my kids are developing their social language, but I'm not seeing that translate into an understanding of academic concepts. So what's planned? Well, we're planning a full-day regional development for administrators and general education teachers serving ELs. Training will also be available using our new EL resource guides for teachers and administrators. So we're not just going to give you these guides, we're going to give you some professional development on how do you use them? What do you do with them now that you have them? What's most important within these guides? Also, remember that we are available, truly, I am available to do coaching at individual schools, and then we're going to give first priority within that to administrators and general ed teachers. And also a first priority to schools that have recently had high EL growth and schools that are serving EL learners for the first time, because we know that there's a more immediate, deeper need in those districts. And then remember that additional webinars will be planned. This is the final in our 3-part intro series, but remember that more webinars are planned. One of our next webinars will focus on language acquisition and what research tells us about how language is actually acquired in the different stages that students tend to go through as they're developing the English language. Remember that we have EL resources. We have EL manuals for teachers and administrators. Those are coming. Those will be rolled out in the next few weeks. And as part of that, again, we're going to have trainings, and there are regional trainings. And then I'm also available to come and talk, even if it's a small group, even if it's grade level leaders or a core group of teachers or to your administrative team. I'm truly happy to come and do that if you reach out to me here by email. I'm continuing to provide some helpful links for you. There are links for academic language in ELs. Coloringcolorado.org is an excellent resource on a lot of topics. Strategies for teaching ELs from Scholastic was something I found helpful. Graphic organizers, information on the silent period that was discussed in our second webinar. Again, remember that we at the Department of Education are here to support you. That really is our focus at MDE, is how can we make districts more effective in their service to students. So remember, reach out to me. I'm the EL coordinator, and then also Taro Funchess is the Title III coordinator over federal programs. Some of you already know and have worked with Taro, and I'm sure have found her to be very helpful. So thank you for your time. I appreciate your interest in the first 3 parts of our webinar on Intro to EL. Check back soon for more information. Thanks again.